My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. You have had a long, diverse, creative career. I mean, music, writing, visual art. When you look back, can you think of what first sparked that creative sense? What first got you creating?
Yeah, I think it stands to reason that I might have found art and creativity one way or the another based on what I believe is probably innate wiring but I did have the blessing, I guess, of two parents who were on very different sides of the spectrum in terms of what they appreciated about art and entertainment. And I was raised in rural Georgia in the 80s and 90s. So we were part of like a conservative Southern Baptist culture that looked very fretfully at best and with outright panic and hysteria at worst at culture at large, but especially art and entertainment. The idea or the conceit that the devil was active and working in Hollywood, rock and roll music, Saturday morning cartoons, was alive and well in our world. And my parents kind of subscribed to some of that. We weren't allowed to watch The Simpsons, and we started with Masters of the Universe, and then we had to stop watching that because it had sorcery and swords in it. So there was some of that. There was some of that like 80s satanic panic in our upbringing. But my dad was like the 70s rocker guy who was really into Queen and Aerosmith and AC/DC. And my mom was a school teacher that was really into literature in particular. So the two of them would kind of break the rules of the culture, and my dad would expose my brother and me to, Queen's The Night at the Opera or Aerosmith's Toys in the Attic and Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, big rock records at the time. And my mom, as soon as I was like, showed any interest in reading, would uh, supply me with books that were above my, pay grade, but that I was fascinated with. And so that cocktail, I think, of my dad's interest in rock music and action movies, he would let us watch. We weren't allowed to watch R-rated movies as kids unless they had Arnold Schwarzenegger in them. So there was such a affection for Arnold that, my dad let us watch Terminator 2 and Commando um so we had access to these different windows of art and entertainment that were both like mainstream and palatable, but also were, had access to um, a lot of literature that, while not obscure by any means, just wasn't the ordinary type of thing that, like a third or fourth grader might
Sure.
read or show interest in. So my mom would give me, books by Sylvia Plath or Franz Kafka, and the two of us would talk about them. Um, and I think both of those things are from a very, my brother and I, for as long as I can remember, we're like, we should start a band. We got to start a band somehow. And, with like the kind of, uh, I guess, accumulating interest in books that began with reading Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park in fourth grade. I was 9 years old. And this was before the film had been released. And it spoke to my like very niche interests as like a dinosaur kid,
Yeah.
and that's like a very contemporary novel, but that completely sparked my imagination in terms of like, oh, this guy came up with this conceit. It's incredible, and what if I could design a story or come up with some kind of incredible other, sandbox kind of world that was then elaborated on when she was like, oh, if you like that, maybe try this, and got into more like of the off the beaten path writers and thinkers that uh really, I guess, I gravitated toward the idea of like, man, there's so much that you can do in writing that you can't do in any other medium. Um, so those have always been, I guess, the things that music, writing, and anything else that I've done is kind of a spin-off of those two things.
Were your parents creators, or were they just more consumers of good art?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, good art and bad art, high art and low art, which I am too. And they, I think that early on, as soon as you begin in your formative years, completely reliant on being supplied art and entertainment, inspiration from other sources and resources. My kids, the only way they watch a movie is if I supply the movie to them or take them to the movie, or um, I get them books. We go to the library, we can pick out books together. So they're not on the internet. They don't have access to, they can drive themselves around. And um, so I'm grateful that we had those resources and in my parents, I mean, as appreciators of their own kind of thing. And all parents, I think, for the most part, I definitely do attempt to, indoctrinate their kids to like the same things that they like because it's
Sure.
fun to share those things.
Yeah.
But my parents were also pretty awesome at encouraging interests that they didn't necessarily share or even understand at times. There was pushback when those interests became particularly transgressive or, offensive or something like that. When you get into art and entertainment, that's like, whoa, what does this mean or say? And they had less of a palette for like, okay, well, let's unpack what it all means, and more like,
Okay.
nah, I don't know if you should be watching or listening to these things, as
Okay.
as is the role of the parent. But they did, when we expressed interest in um, punk rock music or things that they found completely unlistenable, uh, they would still, demonstrate some amount of, well, that's neat. Tell me why you like it. And then we'd poke fun at one another, and my dad would be like, "What the heck is? I can't even listen to this crap." But never to the point where he was like, and you're an idiot if you like this. It
Yeah.
was just more like, hey, that's cool that you like it. I don't get it. And then when
Yeah.
we started to make our own stuff, um, there was stuff that they liked sometimes genuinely, and other stuff that they were like, this is this is nowhere near my.
What would be one like from Showbread maybe that they liked and one that they
Yeah, well, the
didn't take
first
such an interest in?
uh label Showbread record, No Sir Nihilism is Not Practical, they were so excited for us and so proud of us that they desperately tried to find a connection to that
Okay.
record, and they would play it in the car, they'd play it for other people, listen to our kids,
Oh,
but
that's awesome.
it was not their thing. They would never, like, I think they just liked it the way that, like, you can hear your kids, and so
Sure.
they're like, that's cool, but they sincerely loved the follow-up record, Age of Reptiles, which is way more
Okay.
accessible and way more pop oriented, and and their enthusiasm was so, like, naked in the beginning. They're like, now this is what I'm talking about, like, there's a
Oh,
hook
that's
in this.
awesome.
So they ran the gamut. They always expressed enthusiasm for what we did, and would find something in it to talk to us about. And that's fine, like that also I think built in us even from those early formative years, that an understanding that, like, sometimes you don't like the same things or people don't like what you like, and that's fine. In fact, that makes it more interesting. So I'm grateful for that as well.
Do you think that I don't know, even just how far you've gone with creativity came out of the fact that you had supportive parents? Like a while ago, I heard Rick Rubin talking to I can't remember who, Brandy Carlisle, I think, and he was talking about the Abbott brothers and being like, they are the nicest guys I have ever been in the studio with in my life. And I think Brandy was like, what makes them so nice, so such just good guys and confident and whatever. And Rick Rubin said he was talking to their dad when they were in the studio, and he was like, "How'd you raise such good boys?" And the dad said, "I just supported them in everything. Like I had their back no matter what idea they had." And he said, Rick Rubin said, the dad said, he's like, if someone would have come and told me they had shot someone, I would have said, I just someone needed some shooting or something,
That's
hyperbole,
awesome.
but like
Yes,
just the
totally.
power of parents that support. I wonder if maybe even if they hadn't supported you, maybe you would have still created, but maybe even in more rebellion or something.
Mhm.
I don't know. Do
Yeah,
you
for
think there's
sure. I
any?
mean, Well, I'm wired to a fault for rebellion in that as for as long as I can remember, there was some, and I'm not saying that it sounds like I'm trying to make it sound cool. It's not, it's brokenness, but this need to be like go against the grain of whatever
Hmm.
systems, culture, institutions, blah, blah, blah. Which can be repurposed for good things, but by and large is an expression of, I think, brokenness and immaturity
Hmm.
um, and I think that was neither of my parents are like that. So that was a difficult thing for them to wrap their minds around. And when that would express itself aesthetically, when was a teenager, I first discovered uh, the kind of underground culture of gothic industrial music and like a subculture of aggressive electronic music that was shockingly to my mind even more dark and upsetting than like the world of transgressive punk rock.
Yeah.
And it existed on a spectrum from like bands that were like kind of household names in the 90s, Nine Inch Nails being the easiest example, all the way to more obscure bands that no one I knew in my high school, my friends would ever know who Skinny Puppy was or listen to Ministry or something like that. And that made it cooler to me to
Sure.
have my own thing that was, if you put it on for someone, they'd be like, "What the heck is this? This is unlistenable." And then if they, explored the aesthetics and the concepts, the lyricism, they'd be like, "Oh, gross! This is too weird, too upsetting." And I think that I liked that about it. It is, and the misunderstanding would be from my parents that like you like these awful things, whereas I think now I can see in hindsight that it was less that like, "Ooh, I love these lyrics about like suicide and, and death," and more like I was drawn to the idea of taboos in art,
Okay.
or that there being something that's like so provocative in art that it would make one listener go, "What's that?" and another listener like completely repelled. And that
Yeah.
that was really fascinating to me. But of course, from the outside looking in, it looks like, what's wrong with you that you are drawn to these ideas? And it's more of an aesthetic thing for me than an actual conceptual thing, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, yeah, there were like long seasons, and during that time, my parents were just like, "What are you into?" And rather than oh, this is weird to me. I don't like it. Tell me why you like it,
Sure.
and having a conversation. It was more just like we need to put this thing to an end and get you back into something that's less upsetting.
Okay.
Uh, so it was, it's a varied experience. They weren't perfect by any means, but by and large, um, I think they did an amazing job in terms of encouraging interest. Anytime that we like attempted a craft, like when I was a kid, drawing was my thing. I thought that was going to be the way that I primarily expressed it or found a career in like visual arts, and they were just like, 100% on board. And then I was like, actually, I'd like to learn to play guitar. Great, learn to play guitar. And there was never the kind of, even when we took up the unconventional lifestyle of a touring band, which was for years a complete deficit in terms of profit. We made
Sure.
no money, and we saved up our own money to go out on the road, and we booked our own shows and all that. And they, I think, appreciated the commitment. They appreciated
Yeah.
the work ethic. They could see, other people be like, "Oh, when are you guys going to get a real job?" Because in the mind of the, average Joe and Jane, real job means consistent
Yeah.
income, not like work ethic or sacrifice. So they we're like, "Man, this is rough. I could never do it. It's cool that you guys are giving yourselves so completely to
Sweet.
this vision in the hopes that it will become this other thing." So then when we did get signed and when we did generate some amount of, income necessary to fund the thing itself rather than us funding it, um, they were our biggest, they were the biggest celebrators of
Yeah.
that triumph. Wow, you guys, you actually did it, and especially being from Southeast Georgia, there were a lot of people when we got into punk rock culturally and aesthetically that were like, "Why do your kids have these weird haircuts and dress this way and play this awful music?" And they were always the ones who like they'd come to the concerts with a video a
They
camcorder
were
and
there
film.
at Showbread shows.
Oh yeah, yeah, for
Oh,
sure.
sick.
Anytime we played anywhere close, they'd come and they'd go to the merch table, buy merch, put on the, the big t-shirt there at the concert. Which
That's
at the
awesome.
time, of course, we like, ha ha ha, our parents are dorks, but I subconsciously, consciously and subconsciously, we knew that it was some not even everyone in the band had that. So it was
Okay.
something special to have parents who were so supportive of
Yeah,
something
that's
so
awesome.
unconventional in their world. So yeah, I do think that that was a I probably have less of the self-doubt and questioning hangups that a lot of creative people have because I didn't also have to deal with parents who were like, "You can't do this, and this
Yeah.
is bad." You know what I mean? At the same time.
Yep. An interesting conversation, another time if it ever happened would be I'm a contrarian trying to be a pastor.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'd pick your brain on that one day. Uh it's always a
Well,
balance like what you have said of just like where is this immaturity and where is it actually God given and can like I don't know, be a
yeah,
blessing and steer things in a different direction that they normally wouldn't go. But like, where does that get off track? And it's just me doing things because I don't want to be told to do this thing.
yeah,
And,
totally.
and and that's what would have drawn me to Showbread in the early days and still in skate culture and punk rock and
Mhm.
everything else like that. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the short, not I don't want to say solution because that makes it sound airtight, but the short remedy that I found for my own contrarian nature as a pastor and a teacher of Bible and theology is like um deep rings of accountability
mhm.
in people that know me and my wiring and my brokenness. From everywhere from like, if I write a sermon, it goes out to a team of people that read it and give feedback before I ever say anything
Awesome.
on stage to, like the model of church that we have is a kind of a team leadership dynamic. So I don't make any decisions unilaterally,
Okay.
even in my own like quote unquote department. Like the teachings go out to other people for feedback, and if I come up with some cockamamie plan, and the team of people around me, they're amazing. They're so supportive, and for the most part, even if it seems like a stretch, they're willing to be like, yeah, let's try it. It could be a cool idea. And then
Yeah.
other times they have and they will say, this is you on your hobby horse. And it's not you're doing this because you want to provoke and not in a way that's in keeping with people's spiritual formation. It's
Sure.
just to raise hackles. Uh yeah, and then you have to be willing to go like, all right,
Yeah.
I guess I'll cut that line out, or I guess I won't say that thing, which honestly, for someone with my wiring, sometimes it's easy and like, oh, sure, yeah, I didn't mean it that way anyway, so that's fine. And
Yep.
other times I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? I wanted to say this thing and no one's letting me do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, for sure, man. Wait, was there anyone in Showbread that didn't have that contrarian nature that sometimes was like, why are we doing this? But I'll
Yeah,
go
for
along with it.
sure. Yeah. I don't think that it uh bothered someone so completely that they couldn't stand it because they would have left.
Sure.
But there were long-term, wonderful long-term contributors to the Showbread project. It had so many different people involved with it over the
Yeah.
years. Um, One of them is a gentleman named John Giddens who played synthesizer, or more famously live, he played guitar
Yeah.
in
Would
Showbread.
he been play guitar on the Great Depression tour?
He was, yeah, he was
Okay.
there.
Sweet.
Yeah, so he was there for the first like three records. So at a really like crucial kind of point in Showbread's tenure when the band was most known or whatever. But um and he was completely on board for the wackiest of ideas, but he would be the one voice when the record label would ask like, can you change this to make it more palatable?
Yeah.
And we would by, knee-jerk reaction be like, no, in fact, we're gonna make it less palatable. And he would be the guy going like, guys, can we just play ball? If
Yeah.
we play ball, they'll help us. You know what I mean? And then we'd be like, you're not on our side.
Oh, that's funny. Hey, looking back, on Showbread, especially again, are there can you think of any that came out of the kind of this contrariness, this rebellious piece in your nature that now maybe you'd look back at and be like, I wouldn't have done that, or that one I'm a little embarrassed by, or does it still all kind of stand up for you? I think of one, and I like this song, but I wondered if, as the years gone by, if you would still write it or write it differently. I can't remember the title even, but the John Piper song.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I feel
Dear
like
John Piper.
that was a
Yeah, Dear John Piper, Stillbirth in Space is the name of the song.
OJ.
And no, I mean honestly, because my philosophical approach to songwriting in particular, and this sounds like I'm trying to be really, esoteric about it. This is me making my peace with um the nature of songs themselves. I think songs are kind of like these snapshots of sometimes a lifelong disposition, but often a momentary flare of emotion.
Yeah, that's a good
Uh,
point.
and so they're pictures, they're
Yeah,
pictures of you. In some cases, they're pictures of you with a bad haircut. But that's a
sure.
haircut that you had, and then other times they're pictures that capture a beautiful memory or a painful memory. And I think early on, especially with the writing of the Showbread album called No Sir Nihilism is Not Practical, there's a couple of songs on the record that some of the band members wandered may have drifted too far into like a mean-spirited kind of satire. And then, the John Piper song is another example of that same kind of satire. Even the song that people know by Showbread more than most songs, Mouth Like a Magazine,
Yeah.
was about like a person that we all knew,
Oh, interesting.
and it doesn't come off kindly.
Okay.
It's kind of a critique of like a gossip-minded person or a person compelled to gossip, and it's
Everyone
really
in the band would have been aware of who
yeah, they did.
that
They were
guy
like, "Is
was.
this about so and so?" And I
Okay.
was like, "Well, yeah." And they weren't like, oh, well, then we can't do it. It was just more like a introspective moment where they're like, is this an okay thing to do? And
Yeah.
like we were all Christians. I am a Christian. So they were like, is this is this consistent with what we believe to have a song that's like it seems mean-spirited? And honestly, like even though that provoked my defensiveness, I was like, don't tell me what I can and can't write lyrically. There was a part of me that worried that they were right. And so we were on the fence for a while. And I had written another song for that record that was, uh, I think, too mean-spirited.
Okay.
And it was about like a failed relation or an old girlfriend or something like that. And so we had both of these songs kind of in front of us. One of them was way more extreme. Mouth Like a Magazine was a little more abstracted by, metaphor and, it was clear what the song was about, but I don't think someone would be like, this is about this person.
Yeah.
Um, and this is what I eventually formed in my mind. And I think I still hold to this idea that, like, I'm not mad at this person anymore, but this is how I felt when I wrote this song. And I think
Sure.
it's a legitimate snapshot of that feeling. And that's an important or at least a legitimate, maybe even important thing to document and to establish rapport with, a listener or an audience. It's like I've also felt that way. And my argument, came from the amount of writing that we have in the scriptures that record feelings that aren't good or feelings that aren't quote unquote right.
Yeah.
There's especially in poetry, like the middle section of the scriptures, the Psalms are replete with um, like a objectively sinful desire depicted poetically about like wanting to see your enemies' heads crushed and babies thrown against rock. These horrible, horrible things that I think are included in the canon of scripture so that the reader can say like I understand the desperation and the anger, and
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that it's an endorsement of these feelings, but it captures them and records them, and there's a sense of humanity and solidarity in reading them and even experiencing them prayerfully. So we opted to include Mouth Like a Magazine, and this other one, a friend of mine that was in the band took me aside and was like, "Are you doing this? Did you write this for those reasons that it accurately reflect, or did you write this to hurt this person?" And the honest answer was that I wrote it to hurt the person.
Okay.
And he was like, "Well, then let's not do it." And so we didn't.
Does it
Um,
exist somewhere?
I mean, in a
You think?
notebook somewhere,
Okay, it
like a
never it never
no,
got
we never
recorded.
recorded or
Okay.
played it. It was just like a chord chart and some lyrics.
Okay.
Um, and and so from then on out, I think like, I could be wrong, but I think that I consistently upheld that approach to songwriting and lyricism that they record moments, sometimes moments of frustration or despair, um, and that a depiction of an emotion in a song isn't even necessarily an endorsement of
Yeah.
that. It could be that this was a terrible thing to experience and feel. And I would like to address it artistically, not
Mhm.
so that you can have the same feeling, but so that maybe you find it interesting to hear about someone who felt this way, or maybe you felt this way too, or feeling this way now. And so there's a sense of connection
Yeah.
and that. So no, I mean, I don't really, even the John Piper song, I thought the John Piper song was funny. And it's for people who haven't heard this thing, it's just a satire of a theological system that I don't personally agree with, that I
Yeah.
thought would be, I found myself arguing in a grad school class with a good friend who's subscribes to this theological system, and I started to do a caricature of him, and he and I were laughing. So this wasn't like a legitimate argument where I'm like, you basically think this, and I was kind of writing this false worship song from my caricature of his theological position,
Yeah.
and he was like, well, you think this, and he was doing his version, and I just thought it was funny. I thought I'd never heard it characterized quite that way, so I messed around with putting it into a song, and I thought it was amusing, and it opened up this really strange conversation afterward because somehow a handful of people that don't know anything about the band or even that genre of music, but who
Yeah.
are I don't know, have websites or podcasts, found this song and were so deeply offended by it that they insisted on interacting with it as if it was like a theological treatise, like
Yeah.
it was a theological essay, and they're like, well, here's how this line is wrong and here's how this line is wrong, which I found hilarious because it's like, why, why are you dedicating so much space to dissecting punk rock lyrics? And song lyrics don't work the same way an essay does.
Sure.
There's no
Yeah.
footnotes in punk rock lyrics, and it's a satire.
Yeah.
A satire doesn't work the same way as a theological argument. Um, but I get it. It is intended to provoke. It did provoke. I like the idea of it, and after that song came out, I was still in school, so somehow it came up in a class, and they
Okay.
put they put the lyrics up on the projector, and people in class were everyone knew me, so they weren't like actually ticked at me, but people were like, "Are you freaking kidding me?" These, like some people were mad, other people were like, "Oh, I get them." And that was the kind of spirit that I attempted to capture. Was obviously it's sincere. I don't not think those things. I do think those things, but it's a satire. I think satire works differently than other genres of, songwriting or literature and film. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Fiction.
Well, first, I got to go back and listen to. Well, I'll just say, nihilism not practical is. I have three little kids, and they know that album well.
That's
Got
awesome.
to go back and listen to Mouth Like a Magazine with that idea that this was about someone specific, because I think that's good songwriting. Like you guys, obviously, in your context, were like maybe like, is this person going to realize that this is? But to the general public, I would not have any idea
Yeah.
lyrics like Mouth Like a Magazine is about a specific
Yeah. And she
person. I mean,
eventually knew. She
okay.
and I eventually, we were friends. We had a conversation about it. She laughed. She was like, "Thanks a lot." So
It's
it was, it
probably
was fun.
funny too that it became like your
Yeah, and it's like great. And
main
this is the
song.
one song everyone knows. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, talking about the maybe the satire, are there any kind of general ways you think that the church struggles with engaging with with artists, with creatives, or even just with creative mediums. Like I've always thought a little that Christians generally seem to struggle with fiction,
Hmm.
especially when the fiction has anything to do with theology. Because then we're like, this is blasphemous, and this is like instead of just this being someone's interpretation or a fictional
Yeah.
story or whatever. But not even that one necessarily. Are there ways you think the church can do better at engaging with creativity, or again ways that we struggle with it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think off the top of my head, the two big barriers toward um, at least a lot of Western Protestant expressions of church. I think other expressions in the global church and in different Christian traditions have a much easier time engaging the arts and engaging the art in the scriptures. The two big hurdles to a lot of expressions of Western Protestantism are one, that we have no capacity to wrap our minds around metaphor and abstraction and um, anything surreal, anything that's not on the surface.
Hmm.
And there's all kinds of reasons for that, but I think one of the main reasons it didn't come around until relatively recent history, which is the rise of um, Christian art and entertainment as an answer to secular art and entertainment. And the first time that, at least it seems to me, that this became uh, a Christian household idea was with the rise of artists like Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith in the 80s that were, and I don't have anything bad to say about these artists. I actually love Amy Grant. I think Heart in Motion is an incredible record to this day. I have it on vinyl, listen to it all the time. Michael W. Smith's record, same thing. And this was at a time when, uncharacteristic of Christian art and entertainment, these singers and songwriters, musicians, were creating, in this case, pop music that did not sound like a inferior parody of something that happened 10 years prior. It sounded like they were peers. If you listen to Heart in Motion, it sounds like a Genesis record. Or if you listen to Michael W. Smith's Go West, Young Man, it sounds like a Phil Collins record that came out that same year. So these were artists that I think were in tune with kind of the pulse of popular culture. And that was exciting in the Christian culture, but it was also alarming because this is also in a time post the 60s and 70s, because of things like the publishing of the Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey, the Manson family murders in the 70s, the even things like the publishing and release of the film adaptation of The Exorcist. There was this kind of public consciousness around the devil and the devil being in the culture, and mostly in art and entertainment. And that Hollywood is sneaking Satan into everything, and rock musicians, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing, they're sneaking Satan into everything. If you played the Queen record backwards, he's giving you a coded message about smoking marijuana, all that stuff. Led Zeppelin backwards is about Satan. Um, so now there's this excitement. Look, we have a Christian alternative to Phil Collins. Uh, but is that a good thing? Because isn't pop music the devil? And so the demand rose within Christian music, in some cases quantifiably, in institutions like the Dove Awards, where we demanded explicit Christian content from these artists, or else they don't count as Christian artists, meaning.
That was a criteria for the Dev Awards.
Yeah, because I think that and someone can fact check me on this, but I believe it was when the Amy Grant album Heart in Motion was nominated for Dove Awards, and there was some pushback because of, I want to say it's the song Baby Baby, which is a love song for one of Grant's children. It sounds like it's like a boy girl love song, but then it's actually written for like one of her kids.
Yeah.
Um, and she had other like love songs on the album that were completely like, innocuous. They're completely inoffensive. They're just, romance songs or whatever. But then there are lots of other songs on the record that were explicitly traditionally pop Christian songs. But Baby Baby, I think, was nominated, and so there was like, this song doesn't say anything about Jesus. It doesn't have any scripture in it. There's no chorus. It's like praise him, praise.
Yeah.
And so people were like, should this even be nominated for a Dove Award? Amy Grant had performed at the Grammys, and people thought, I mean, like by today's standards, it's just like positively prudish. But at the time, it's like she was dancing around. So is that too sexy? You know? Um, and there was this panic that we were allowing Christian art to kind of bend to the whims of secular art, big bad secular art. And so I believe the Dove Awards actually installed in their qualifying criteria that there has to be some explicitly Christian content or some mention of Jesus. I don't forget the exact wordage. I talk about this in my book with all its teeth. And uh and that landmark, I'm not saying that like that was the thing that echoed across culture, but like that kind of is that is kind of indicative of an expectation that became predominant in Christian culture, and I would argue is still like pervasive in church culture, in that we expect Christian art and entertainment to adhere to certain formulas. And it's not just lyrical formulas in terms of songs, like we expect it to sound a certain way. If you engage with worship leaders in churches across America and ask them like, what are your frustrations in trying to, create a artistically excellent atmosphere of worship in your church? A lot of them, maybe even most of them, will tell you something along the lines of there's an expectation worship has to sound like this. Worship, the lyrics have to be like this.
Hmm.
And by when they say this and this, they mean a standard created by like three megachurch worship conglomerates that have unfortunately settled the standard for worship sounds like this. And unless it sounds like that, and it could be very lyrically straightforward, but if it sounds a certain way, then like that doesn't sound like worship. And worship is supposed to sound like dated Coldplay, or like slightly updated U2. Worship is supposed to sound like slightly out of touch, 10 years in the past indie rock. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And that anyone who's trying to move the needle on that a little bit experiences pushback. So, and the reason is that we think, and by we, I mean we and various Protestant expressions of church, especially in the West, think that metaphor means not real. And we think that any kind of abstraction is too abstract and
Hmm.
it's not clear and we don't know what we're talking about. And the reason that this is like a huge bummer, and I would argue can be deeply destructive for not just churches, but for people in their spiritual formation, is not because, oh, wow, our taste is so bad and we don't have cool music or anything like that. But if you create a standard in which you have no paradigm for surrealism, for metaphor, for abstraction, you are going to have a terrible time with the Bible, which is replete with surrealism, metaphor, abstraction, poetry, hyperbole. If you and then that brings me to my second. So that's one thing. We don't have enough room for abstraction, for
Hmm.
surrealism, for metaphor, hyperbole, things that aren't explicit. We like our Christian art explicit. The other big problem is that we have no paradigm and no room for art that transgresses, art that offends, art that provokes, because we think that an artistic depiction of a thing is equal to an endorsement of the thing, meaning a song about despair means you should feel despair.
Yeah.
A song that um, deals with sexuality is an endorsement of sexual, or some kind of sinful sexuality, expression of sexuality. Um, and again, if this is your approach to the arts, you are going to have a terrible time with the scriptures, which are demonstrably filled with offensive imagery. And not just like, it might offend your grandma. I mean, like objectively, intentionally provocative materials, and not just recorded history, not just like, oh, okay, well, yeah, but that actually happened. It's history in poems, in
Hmm.
parables, hyperbole, in the teachings of Jesus, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament.
So would you say
The-
you might not think you have a problem? You're just going to read them in a certain way that's going to be problematic. Would
exactly.
you say that?
Yes. And yes. And so we aren't prepared to let the scriptures be what they want to be. And I know this to be the case because I did a series in our church on art in the Bible, and after having written this book, and I didn't even want to do it. I was kind of like, I wrote a book about art. It's coming out, and then the elders or overseers of our church were like, well, you should also teach on it. If it's important enough to write about, you should teach on it. So I was like, fine. I was worried this is one of my hobby horse things. No one cares.
Yeah.
But anyway, one of the evenings in this series on art, I wanted to demonstrate how chock full the scriptures are of materials that really provoke just about any reader imaginable, not just your grandma, not just you because you have this experience, but there's something in here that's intentionally placed to get a rise out of you, to make you feel a certain way. And that feeling isn't necessarily, oh, that's so nice. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so I took a brief tour of some of these intense passages in the scriptures. I even censored some of them contextually. Like, I won't get into all the details. You can read it on your own time, but there's this. And then, all right, let's turn here. Now there's this. And, there's an entire book that's just scholarly consensus, a book of erotic poetry that's just meant to be enjoyed. It
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily have any kind of, well, it's a metaphor for, it's just a collection of poems about sex. There's violence. There's really grisly imagery, even in the teachings of Jesus. Like you should gouge your eyeball out of your head, or you should eat. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And we know what that means now, but imagine the audience being like, "You're out of your mind."
Mhm.
Um, and that's all I did. I did not then get into my arguments for art. I was just like, I just want us to experience this and consider what this means and what that says about God as an artist. And people were ticked. People were ticked. All I did was read Bible for 40 minutes or something like that, and then invited people to think about what that means and how could you say these things? How could you read that in front of and um I don't mean to make light of those. Those are legitimate reactions. I'm not trying to like make fun of these people. These are my people. But
Yeah.
the um my invitation to them was like, but do you okay, so you see what I'm getting at, that like what does that mean that you're provoked by these, and what does that say about the art, that it is provocative? And of course, the pushback comes, it's an all or nothing pushback. And this is the pushback I experienced with the book about art and with the series about art, is that like, oh, great. So anything goes. We can all just watch and listen to anything we want. We should not express any discernment whatsoever because that's not honoring the scriptures and everything. Of course not. That's ridiculous. And that's never anything that I've advocated for. What I'm advocating for personally and pastorally is a more nuanced, um, approach to all kinds of art and entertainment with accountability, with Holy Spirit led discernment, with, allegiance to the scriptures and the way of Jesus. And that means, I think personally, that like something that offends one person might not necessarily be wrong for another person. It just depends. And to evaluate exactly how we understand those things, you need things like community accountability, people speaking into your lives, and all those kinds of things. So those are, to me, the two big roadblocks. One is that we don't have enough of a shelf for things that aren't explicitly clearly stated, and we don't have enough of a shelf for art that doesn't just uplift, art that doesn't just inspire, but
Mhm.
like art that offends, art that provokes. And my, conviction in addressing and I hope eradicating both of these problems, or at least contributing to a long-term process of eradicating them, isn't like because I want to listen to crazy music or I want to watch some wild R-rated movie. My conviction is like I want us as disciples of Jesus to have a more robust understanding of the scriptures.
Mhm.
I've told my people at my church for years and years and years that like I think all Christians should read a tremendous amount of fiction because the Bible is a story, first and foremost. It's structured like a story. I mean, there's all these other different genres that are in it, but it exploits and utilizes themes, motifs, and ideas that are still prevalent in novels and in cinema, all over the world and have been for centuries. And if you're like, I've never cracked a novel once in my life, then like I think that it's more difficult for that person to take the Bible on the Bible's terms. You know,
Hmm.
I can't count how many times every morning I read the scriptures with my kids, and right now we're reading through Mark with them, and we'll finish a story and they'll ask questions. And honestly, so many of my answers sound something like, well, in that movie,
Yeah.
this, because it's this, the vehicle of story is like how humans are wired neurologically to process the world. And it's honestly so much more helpful to an 11-year-old, to an 8-year-old to go, right, that was in that movie. I do understand that story. Than to be like, well, in Greek, you know what I mean? And what you have to understand about first century culture, I mean, we do that stuff too, but there's something that actually permeates the heart
Hmm.
about being able to go through. Remember that book that we read together and that story about this person and their pain and death, or, things that aren't necessarily like, hooray.
Yeah.
Well, that's what this story is getting at. And do you see it now? And them going, I do see it now because I have this other window into that world of story. That was my very long way of saying those are two big things.
Those would be ones I completely agree. So it's I don't know, affirming or interesting to hear you voice the same thing. I mean, kind of the struggle with fiction and need clarity. But do you think this is true? And I mean, I think it's kind of funny if it is that we struggle with metaphor and not having perfect clarity and just a sharp non-fictional interpretation of scripture. But when it comes to things that are completely unrelated to the scriptures or to our faith, then we can suddenly drop all boundaries and watch anything or listen to anything. Like in some ways we might not be good at interpreting it, but we can receive fiction real easily when it has nothing to do with our faith. But all of a sudden, if it's like, oh, The Chosen, tweaked this little thing, then we're like up in arms. But
Yeah,
we're
it's kind of wild, isn't it? Like, my
like,
first
do you see that?
experience.
Is there a boundary there that we?
Yeah, well, I mean, it just depends. It depends on the form, the genre, what it means to accomplish, what it doesn't mean to accomplish. I mean, go back to what I was saying about that song I wrote. Like, is the Showbread song Dear John Piper intended to be a definitive theological essay and statement on Calvinism? No, of course not. It's a 3-minute satire in the form of song lyrics. It's meant to do one thing, and that's
Yeah.
to like poke fun, provoke, and raise questions essentially. Um, and if that's what it intends to do, I would argue it accomplishes that goal. If what it intends to do is make a definitive theological statement about a reformed theology, then it fails miserably. And if you hold it to that standard, then it's really easy to be like, here's where it fails, here's where it fails, here's where it
Yeah.
fails, and then in steps the songwriter to be like, that's not what I was trying. I wasn't trying to do that. And this has been the case for, and on one level, I understand. My first experience of it was um, as a very young kid, and this I think was 1988, 89. The Don Bluth film, The Land Before Time,
Okay.
was my brother and I were so excited to go see this movie in theaters. We saw an ad for it on television. We're like, it's an animated movie about dinosaurs. It looks so cool. Um, but the only theater in Savannah, Georgia, playing The Land Before Time was also playing at the same time Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ,
Okay.
starring Willem Dafoe as Jesus. Um, and The Last Temptation of Christ, which is based on a novel of the same name, depicts a moment in Jesus it's been years since I've seen it, but it depicts a moment, a fantasy, or in Jesus's mind as he's on the cross or when he's about to go to the cross. I can't remember where he just briefly considers what his life would have been like had he not opted to go to the cross. And in among the things included in that fantasy, the fantasy that populates the bulk of the movie, he's married to Mary Magdalene, and I can't remember if he has kids or and I think conflating the novel and the book a little bit. But anyway, uh, clearly intended as an exercise in fiction.
Okay.
Now, on one level, I understand the sensitivity people feel about the story of Jesus, and I will admit that as much as I go on about art and creative freedom, I've been guilty of this. When you feel such profound affection for a person and a story, it's honestly the same thing as when you go see a film adaptation of a novel and you're like, they changed it. You know what
Sure.
I mean?
Yeah,
And
that's a good
you're
point.
upset.
Yep.
Uh, I experienced that too, where I'm like, oh man, don't mess with don't mess with the Jesus story. And then there's other times where I'm like, with Martin Scorsese in particular, like I could be wrong. I don't think Martin Scorsese claims to be a Christian. If he does, that's news to me.
Mhm.
I don't remember if the author of the novel claims the same. It seemed to me to just be like an interesting exercise in fiction. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, why would I expect these guys to have like some biblically sound thing? You know what I mean? It's just a movie, and
Yeah.
it's in that sense kind of fascinating to see what these people think when they think about Jesus. And look, Jesus
Yeah.
is in a mainstream movie by Martin Scorsese. That's wild. Even back then, that's a wild idea. So that never, even as an adult, when I went back and revisited this thing, it never bothered me. But we weren't allowed to go see The Land Before Time in that theater because the Christians at our church were boycotting it because it was playing Martin Scorsese's
Sure.
Last Temptation of Christ. Luckily, another theater picked it up and we got to go see The Land Before Time. So all's well that ends well.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to me that, if it had been, to your point, a film about someone who made some other kind of great sacrifice in his life that cost him an ordinary life. We have
Mhm.
a million stories like these. And while he's in the throes of the great sacrifice, he fantasizes about what his life might have been like had he not gone to war or gave everything to, make this art, whatever it might be. And he sees himself as having a little family, and no one would ever say a word about it. But as soon as you introduce these uh, explicitly biblical things into that cocktail, now it's held to a certain standard. Whereas, like, good and evil themes in Marvel movies or Harry Potter stories, we love to read in
Yeah.
biblical motifs and analogies. We like to try to bend it a little bit so that we can see. And I don't think there's anything wrong. Of course, if you're a Christian, you're going to experience your worldview. I do.
Yeah.
Like, I interpret things through a theological lens that I know for sure the author didn't intend,
Sure.
but that's because that's how I see the world, and I'm fine with it. Uh, but then when it is explicitly Christian, like you bring up The Chosen, then there's always going to be a constituency of viewers, or in a lot of cases, non-viewers who haven't even seen the dang thing, but that want to complain because they read somewhere that it does this or does that.
Yeah.
And I think that it just depends, like whether or not those complaints are legitimate depends on what the artist intends to do and whether or not it accomplishes what the author intends. I don't have any issue with The Chosen or anything. I've not seen it, and not because I'm too cool for it. I haven't watched any TV shows. I'm a movie person. But
Yeah.
anyway, TV shows are a time investment. So if the creators of The Chosen intended to make an absolutely dedicated, faithful, word for word adaptation of whatever, the gospel, synoptic gospels or whatever it is that they're doing, and then they don't, then maybe that's cause for critique. If they say like we did this faithfully and you're like no you didn't, it deviates in this way, then that's a legitimate engagement of the art on a
Yeah.
critical level. But if the creators of The Chosen, and I'm assuming that this is the case, are more like we're trying to faithfully tell the story of Jesus, translate it into a TV format, so that means that we are going to have to take some artistic liberties, that we are going to have to move certain narrative bits in such a way that make the story more cohesive for television, but that don't also egregiously violate the spirit of the
Mhm.
Gospels. Now, again, this is pure conjecture because I don't know those
Sure.
guys and I haven't seen the thing. I'm assuming that's the approach.
Yeah.
Then it's not legitimate, I would argue, to be like, oh, that's not exactly right. It's like, well, of course not, because this is what we're trying to do. Even like Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which is a hyper divisive. I mean, that was a cultural moment as
Yeah.
well, and it's a film I really like. I like Mel Gibson's directorial work. Probably The Passion is the best. The Passion, Apocalypto. I enjoy these movies, and The Passion is replete with artistic liberties. Some of them, I would argue personally, pretty theologically astute. And upsetting. There's a scene during the flogging of Jesus, which is the most infamous scene in the movie because it goes on for so long and it's so gratuitous, during which the Satan, who's depicted as a bald woman, is kind of pacing the ground, the Roman grounds, as Jesus is being flogged, and she's cradling what appears to at first be a baby, but then is revealed to be like a grown man, this grotesque kind of grown man. Uh, and it's strange. It's kind of abstract. It's not exactly evident what it means. Like one might interpret it as like, oh, it's a corruption of innocence and an exploitation of something good, which is also being mirrored in the flogging of Jesus. And I think that that's cool. It's cool imagery. It's effective. It's certainly like it's like upsetting on top of upsetting,
Hmm.
which is I thought like appropriate for that. But I remember at the time there being other people like, there's no mention in the Gospels of the devil walking around with a man baby, and
Yeah.
well, of course not. Of course not. Like he's taking some creative liberties, and it seems to me like in this particular medium, that's an appropriate thing to do. So yeah, I think like sometimes some sensitivity is appropriate based on the terms of the art itself, and other
Yeah.
times people need to chill the heck out.
Those are all good points, especially I think that like yeah, it's the things that we have an affection for.
Hmm.
That's a good point. Uh, and the one person that seems to get a buy through all of this, I feel like, is C.S. Lewis.
He
Nobody ever,
does, doesn't he?
nobody ever is
We
hung
let
up
him off
about
the hook for
Narnia
everything.
or
Yeah. He puts
yeah,
wild theological ideas into his stories,
right?
and
Yeah.
we just either don't talk about them, or when they come up, everyone goes, yeah. But again, case in point, C.S. Lewis and infamously, The Last Battle, the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia series, or a book like The Great Divorce. These are two works of fiction that seem to, he's not around to say, but they seem to advocate in some way for post-mortem evangelism in the case of The Great Divorce, and in the case of The Last Battle, some kind of inclusivism.
Yep.
And I mean that in the theological sense,
Hmm.
not in the broad cultural sense. Uh, but exactly to what degree, unclear.
Yeah.
Or whether he literally believed like upheld or subscribed to these theological ideas, don't know. It could have been the case that The Great Divorce is just the setting for a fictional story that intends to communicate like why, it intends to, in some sense, answer the question of how would anyone ever not choose God? And if they do, how can God hold them responsible justly,
Yeah.
you know? And so the
Yep.
book deals with the idea of freedom, and the reality that even in heaven, some people would not choose heaven. I mean, that's kind of like a jacket
Yep.
summary of The Great Divorce, and it's a great novel. You
Yeah.
can read it in one sitting. It's fascinating. Some really profound, simple imagery, and then some really complex. Like, wait a minute, what does that mean? What are you trying to say? And I think that's just the work of a great artist.
Hmm.
And I love, and I've read not all of them yet, but the Chronicles of Narnia with my kids. I love it. I love the whole. I was even I didn't read The Last Battle till I was an adult. I grew up with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and reading The Last Battle. There's an infamous scene where a worshiper of the pagan god Tash ends up in the kingdom of the final kingdom of Narnia with Aslan, and I'm again paraphrasing, but Aslan in somehow has interpreted the worship of Tash as worship unto himself, and it's actually a beautiful little passage of redemption, but it makes the reader go, wait a minute, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
Because throughout the story, it's been clear that this, you know, um, Aslan is not a metaphor for Jesus. He actually is Jesus in
Yeah.
a different dimension. The books go on to, by the time you get to Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he says it explicitly.
Hmm.
um, so yeah, it leaves but again, I think that that's great art because, and I love the idea of there being these little landmines in these works that you and me, these books are old as
Yeah.
dirt. And you and me are still going, man, that thing in the what the heck is that? You know?
Well, that's where I
And
wonder sometimes too if the art gets a buy, if it's like, if it's kind of if we're receiving it kind of posthumous.
Mhm.
Like I
I
always think
wish we
that
were
this
better
is
at it now.
unrelated, but
Yeah.
like I'm always like, how are we still listening to Michael Jackson's music when R. Kelly's in jail?
Yeah.
Like we cancel him, but this guy nobody ever
Yeah. Well, I
mentions.
mean, we are an infamously inconsistent people when it
For
comes
sure.
to
But I
what we
wonder if
allow and
Michael
don't
was,
allow.
well, I guess he was alive for a long time when this was going on. But it's just funny sometimes who gets the rules and who doesn't.
Hmm.
So Lewis
Yeah.
on the news.
Honestly, with C.S. Lewis, or, you know, other great theologians that had in their theology something that would, if not give pause to certain Orthodox mainstream traditions, to which I belong as well,
Mhm.
would at least be question marks. Like, what exactly do you mean by that? And but we evaluate the theologian or the figure, the artist in Christian history based on the broad scope of their work, rather than nitpicking a
Mhm.
single idea. I mean, and I'm not saying that like anything, like grossly heretical gets a pass. I'm all, I've written about it extensively. I'm all about orthodoxy. It's very important
Yeah.
to me. But, even figures like a Martin Luther King Jr., if you read all his sermons and essays, reads like a very traditional Southern Baptist minister. But if you read his doctoral writings, there's every now and then something in there that you're like, wait, what? Did he believe this? Or was this just something he was working out in his higher education? Because I mean, I've written weird stuff in seminary that's like, I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out what I think about stuff. And
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, like if he was around today and we were like, hey, did you believe in postmortem evangelism? Would he go like, I don't know, man, maybe? Or would he say like, no, dude, that was just a novel,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When I was in school when that freaking book, The Shack,
Yeah.
came out.
Oh, that's the perfect example.
Man, people were so ticked about this thing, and I remember reading it, and I don't mean to say anything derogatory. I found it, just be like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, because I read it as a novel, I'm like, no, I don't know. As a novel,
Yep.
I wasn't sure it worked wonderfully or didn't work wonderfully. It just wasn't my thing. It wasn't the kind of novels I usually like to read. And I read a lot of novels. But I was like, yeah, I think I get the idea. Then I go to school and people are like losing their minds. Oh my God, we got to do something about this. Let's do something about what? You know what I mean? Like, it seems evident to me from the beginning, like this is not meant to be some
Just
kind
I
of,
think just like your Piper song. It was
yeah,
like
yeah,
the guy
exactly.
I
Like take it on
imagine the
its own
author
terms.
was like, this is not a treatise
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
Holy Spirit.
And maybe this dude's a heretic, maybe he isn't. I don't
Yeah.
know. But I don't know if we can determine it from this book because the book is clearly a work of fiction. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
For sure.
You'd have to get him some coffee and ask him what he actually believes about the nature of the Trinity and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
But people freaked out because it actually has Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit hanging out in the cabin in
And
the
I think,
book.
like you already said, a lot of the people that were freaking out hadn't read the book.
Yeah, well, of course. That's never going anywhere. Yeah. Yeah, there's this great anecdote I think about all the time where Kevin Smith, the filmmaker Kevin Smith, who directed a film in the late 90s called Dogma, which also depicts God and Gabriel, Michael. The movie revolves around God has taken a trip to Earth to play skee ball and gone missing. And so forces from heaven and hell are on Earth trying to figure out what's going on. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck play Michael and Gabriel, and it's a comedy. It's like a religious comedy. And it's pretty fun. If you like Kevin Smith movies, which are notoriously very crass and over the
Yeah.
top, like it's a fun bit of filmmaking. Again, like the ridiculousness is so obvious. Kevin Smith at the time was a Catholic.
Okay.
So he wasn't even trying to, like point some kind of blasphemous fun at the church. He did these things from to his at least his statement, as a believer.
Yeah.
And maybe he was right or wrong, but it was, he would not have claimed to be like, I was trying to bring the church down or something like that. But protesters lined up when the movie premiered, and then Kevin Smith famously went and he protested his own movie with the protesters. And since no one knows what directors look like, no one recognized him. They just thought he was a protester. And then someone showed up and interviewed the protesters. They gave Kevin Smith a microphone, like, "What do you not like about the movie?" And he's like, "Well, I've never actually seen it, but I've been told it's not good." And his later, when he was asked about why he said that, he's like, "Well, because I wanted to be in character." Like these protesters haven't seen the movie. They just
Yeah,
that's always the
that's
thing.
funny. Yeah, we had when you talked about the theater, like about Land Before Time and stuff. We're in a fairly small town, in our theater a while ago, someone had left a note on the window when Wicked was playing. They were like, "Do your research. How dare you bring this film in or whatever?" But I mean, the people I'm sure had never seen Wicked. They were just offended that the theater was bringing Wicked in.
Yep. And man, choose your battles. Come on.
Yeah, well, I mean, what do you expect too sometimes of non-Christian? If Kevin Smith had not been been a Catholic and made that movie, I would still be like, yeah, that made sense. I can see the humor. He
Hmm.
doesn't have my worldview. Like this theater, I mean, the week before, had brought in something on the polar opposite. Then,
Yeah, totally.
like some Christian themed movie, like they're covering the gambit, but they don't share the worldview of the viewer. Uh,
Yeah. The
anyways, I just
theaters buy these movies from the studios and then they play them for money. They're like
yeah, yeah.
the imposition of the worldview is like a famously non-flattering, even, kind of evangelical trait that like you better adhere to our worldview even if you don't share it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in the culture wars, the arts and entertainment have been in the crossfire of that exchange the entire time, which is take this movie out of the theater. It's like, just don't see it. It's not for
Yeah.
you. How about that?
Yeah. Yeah. And that I could go on for, but just that everyone that is not a believer should think like you about this, or even that believers should think like you about this. Like we conflate, I think, Christianity with our views of this, that, and the other.
Yeah, the
Anyways,
entitlement is often breathtaking.
I could ask you 1,000 more questions, Josh, but it's after the hour. I don't want to keep you longer. I'm sure you have a lot to do and a sermon to prepare and whatnot. Could I ask you just two more quick, short
Totally.
questions, just
Yep.
more fan questions? Where did Josh Dies come from? Uh, and is that on I don't know, the trajectory? Is that at all related to your latest book? Uh,
Oh, no, no, that's a good point.
okay.
I didn't think about that. No, it came from around the time that the band Showbread was forming a more personal identity for itself because we started as like a church band
Okay.
and that became then like we were all got into punk rock music and were like a pop punk thing that would play at our friends' parties and crappy venues in our neighborhood.
Were you starting
Um,
doing covers even? Were
yeah,
you a
yeah.
cover
Like
band?
when we began, we were doing alternative Christian covers in our
Sweet.
church, like
Okay.
songs from like the second, third day record or early Skillet or DC Talk or something like that.
Sweet.
We didn't start writing our own stuff till we got into punk rock music and kept the same band name. The band should have changed names like 10 times, but it didn't.
Okay.
Um, and so we got into punk rock music, started writing our own stuff, but it was more influenced by like, Epitaph, Fat Records, kind of Lagwagon and No Use for a Name, MXPX, that kind of even early Blink 182, that kind of stuff. And then we kind of discovered, I guess, more of a niche for ourselves the more active that we became. And one of the bands that I think was instrumental in helping us gain the confidence to form our own identity was a band called 90 Pound Wuss
Sure.
that had, and in particular, they had a record called Where Meager Die of Self-Interest and a record called Shorthand Operation that are both really formational to the overall Showbread aesthetic. And their singer, who's a dude I know now, his stage name, as it were, was Jeff Suffering, which I
Okay.
thought was such a cool, like, on the nose, almost tongue in cheek, but like had this, like, and I had this background in goth, and goth rock, Bauhaus and The Cure and stuff like that. And it sounded to me like that kind of thing, like this, uh, death rock thing that didn't quite fit in the punk rock world, and I liked that about it. So I was like, I'm gonna come up with a name for myself like that. So it was honestly just an emulation of that dude and his stage name, Jeff Suffering and Josh Dies.
That's sweet.
And
Well,
it, it's like it had a
that's
simple
the only
ring
way
to it.
we ever knew of you. I mean,
Yeah.
when I started hearing Josh Porter, it was like, who's Josh Porter? Like Robert Zimmerman
Yep, totally.
kind of thing. Yeah. Uh, and can I just say, last question, what do you have a favorite? I don't know, favorite. It's probably like your favorite children, but one that stands out the most, a Showbread album
Yeah,
that
I
you're
like
most proud of,
Cancer,
even?
the album
Cancer?
called Cancer.
Yeah.
And and then, just beside it is the kind of somewhat recent posthumous Showbread record that we wrote and released called Our Fathers Were Models for God that people hate. And I like it for that reason.
Okay.
And the reason I like those two is like to me, the Cancer album, which also wasn't everyone's cup of tea, and I like that about it. I listen to it and it's the record that I go, man, I can't believe we made that. It's to
Sweet.
me, it sounds like it came out better than I thought it. And we were really trying to do a big operatic glam rock. It was, kind of like, what if glam era Bowie had made a punk rock record, that was
Yeah.
theatrical and over the top. And when I listened to it, I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And we did it. And to me, it works on all those levels. And then Our Fathers Were Models for God is the kind of record that like if we had had the resources, we would have made it a long time ago. It's
Okay.
like, a lot of people that whether they liked it or didn't like it were like, it sounds like Nine Inch Nails and David Bowie. I was like, yep, that's exactly we would have done it a long time ago if I would have had access to better equipment,
Yeah.
basically, and knew how to program drum machines and synthesizers better, and weren't as married to the rock band format, which is like, well, we got to have guitar one, guitar two, bass. And that's a record that we just made in the studio with like, what if a song only had a sequencer in it? What if a
Yeah.
song only had two synthesizers and fake drums, and so in that sense, it's like really creatively unhinged. And I like that about it too. And I like that it makes people so upset conceptually.
Well, there's not a Showbread album I haven't loved, man, even though, I'd put them in different orders and
Sure.
stuff. But on the one hand, because No Sir Nihilism, Not Practical was always, oh, it was my first album, so I think it's always been my favorite. So on one level, I always hoped every album would sound like No Sir Nihilism's Not Practical, even with like just the two singers,
Yeah.
the thrash, the I don't know, the real punk rock, the screams, everything about that. But then at the same time, I've loved Showbread because every album felt like you had recreated yourselves as a band. I mean, they're so diverse.
Well,
You have
thanks, man.
your
Yeah, I
catalog.
think
I just like it's hard to put you in any genre, I feel like.
Yeah, I think too, maybe like for better or for worse, whether you like this or love this, I was and we were always like a discography minded
Okay.
band. I liked the idea of, and my biggest influence, like I just said, were Nine Inch Nails, David Bowie, bands like the Flaming Lips, who are like, you don't even know or Nick Cave, you don't even know what the genre the album is
Mhm.
going to be, let alone like if it'll lean this way or that way.
Yeah.
And I like a lot of bands that are consistently like it'll pretty much sound like this. I think, like, but I wanted us to be the kind of band where it was like the discography could become an argument for fans and detractors to be like, I hate that record. And someone else is like, are you kidding? That's the
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
best one.
That's awesome.
And we would often make records or, like even we made an album called Who Can Know It that was just made because it was like, I want there to be a black sheep in the discography. Like a band like Kiss had a disco record, and
Yeah.
I love the idea of people talking about like, oh God, that disco record is the worst Kiss record. Or Kiss had a record with no makeup, and
They really did.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So it's
that's
like
crazy.
the idea of having the album that's like this is going to be the piano ballad album, and people are
Yeah.
going to be like, what? But then maybe someone will be like, that's actually the only one that I like.
Like the Weezer debates, I
Yeah,
think.
the Weezer debates exactly.
Where it's like I hate it or I love it for certain.
Yep.
You did that well, I think.
Thanks,
You made it.
man.
Uh, Yeah, I don't know. A discography, I'm sure there's lots of debates on which is best, but I would just say too, I was thinking of Hawthorne Heights. I forget that front man's name, but I remember him talking only a few years ago on some podcast. He was like, people liked I forget the album, but with Ohio is for Lovers or whatever. They liked that. So ever since then, we're just trying to recreate that album over and over. And as a fan of that album, I like that. That like I always like Hawthorne Heights will always have these, kind of stream vocals and clean vocals and the Smiths and but in a just different way. I love Showbread that I never knew what was coming.
Yeah,
So
totally. I mean,
yeah,
again, yeah, it's an aesthetic. It's a time to play. I don't think one's better than the other at all. One approach is better than the other. I don't think AC/DC should make an EDM record. I don't
sure.
think that that would be cool.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a palette that they've created for themselves that works for them, and it's appropriate that they make. This sounds like I'm beating up, but they make the same record in a different way over and
yeah,
over that they have. And fans come to them with that expectation, me among them.
yeah,
And then there's other artists that if they made the same record again, you'd be like, what? You already did this one.
yeah,
Surprise
yeah.
me.
Yeah, for sure. The latest book is How to Die.
How to Die, a
Not out
spiritual
yet.
odyssey through Christian discipleship.
Sweet. It's not quite out yet, right? Or is
Oh,
it
it comes
already
out
out?
in August. Yeah,
August. Okay.
August. And this thing, I'm very fascinated to see what the reaction to this, but not in because there's some like wild offensive thing in it or some unconventional idea, but um, I set out to write a book on discipleship and I was freaking fighting that thing. It was so hard to write, and I kept like not allowing myself to do it the way I wanted to do it because books on discipleship should fit a certain criteria. And then at
Yeah.
some point, I was like, forget it. I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, even if it comes out
Sweet.
really unconventional. And it did.
Well, I'll be interested to read it kind of, in juxtaposition to what's it, John Mark Comer's latest discipleship stuff.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
knowing again well, he was kind of trying sure, I don't know. Yeah, he was a bit of Rob Bell probably in that
hmm
his
Yep.
thing, but then your nature, contrariness, and your struggle with, as you say, writing it, it'll be interesting to see. I can't wait to read it, man, for sure.
Well, yeah, man. You'll have to tell me what you think. We'll see.
Is it David C. Wells or whatever?
David C.
Is that
Cook.
the
Yeah.
or C. Cook? I mean, okay,
Yep. Yep.
cool.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm very, very happy with it. It is this sounds like a self-congratulatory thing to say, but it's not it's very much not like a lot of Christian nonfiction, for better
Okay.
or for worse.
Hmm.
Um, and is maybe closer in spirit to something that like Brennan Manning might have written,
Okay.
and is more driven by stories, narrative, and kind of stream of consciousness prose as opposed to like self-help essays.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I don't mean that in a pejor- I read what you might describe as conventional Christian nonfiction all the
Sure.
time. I've got a stack of them right here on my desk. It's important. I, but like John Mark's a great example. There's a million really good books on discipleship
Yeah.
that are more straightforward, do this, kind of thing, that are necessary, vital. I don't think I had anything great to add to that
Yeah.
world. What I have to add is something a little bit different, and I hope it turns out to be
Yeah.
useful for someone.
Okay. Well, I can't wait, man. Josh, thank you so much for your time and thank you for Showbread, as well
Yeah,
as
of
all the
course.
other literary and visual stuff you've done. But man, that's still a soundtrack to my days. So
Thanks,
appreciate you
man.
and all you've stood for and the example now that you are uh to me as someone that lived in that world, still lives in that world, with such a put out such influential music and still loves Jesus and
Yeah.
ended up in the pastorate. Uh,
Well,
that's
thanks,
an
man. Yeah.
encouraging story for me, for sure.
Thanks, dude. That means a lot to me. Thanks for having me. It was a good time.
My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Before we even jump in, can I just ask you a question? I live in BC, in like the
Okay.
interior of BC. So we're not far from Spokane. So that's where we go for most of our shows. Is there any chance you remember like in the like early 2000s going to Spokane, Washington? I mean, or the whole tour. I mean, what we saw in Spokane with Showdown and
Hmm.
Blindside on the Great
Yeah.
Depression tour.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
man,
Yeah.
that was the best. I mean, that was a long time ago. That's the best show I and I don't know friends out here have ever been to. And
That's
Showbread
awesome.
was the crazy. I mean, seeing Blindside was awesome, but that was the
Yeah.
first time we had seen you guys with the two lead singers and like
Mhm.
the red and black, and
Yeah, it was a
that
blast.
was
I mean, I
crazy.
remember that tour well because it was
Yeah,
awesome. It was a lot of fun.
was it a big deal for you to be with Blindside? Was
Yeah,
that
yeah, we were all huge Blindside fan. Well, especially of the second they had their second record, which is not readily available anymore. It's not on streaming services or anything, but they had
which one?
it was called A Thought Crushed My Mind.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that was my favorite for sure.
Yeah, that was a really influential show record to the Showbread
Okay.
aesthetic. Um, so getting to be on tour with them was
That was
was
a
huge for us. It was a blast.
That's
Yeah.
sweet. Was it a long tour?
It was, yeah, it was like 8 weeks or something like that.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
And probably vans for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we only ever toured in a van.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Blindside too, they were probably still
They were, I
van
think,
level.
because it was their first tour back in the States in a really long time.
Okay.
As I recall, they had because they ascended from Solid State Records and their European label to Atlantic.
Okay.
They got a major label deal and they had at least a couple of, I mean, hit records might be stretching it, but they had bigger records. They had
Sure.
records with like songs on the radio and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but then
POD had a
they,
big influence, I think, right?
yeah, yeah, they were buddies with
Could be wrong.
POD. POD, as I recall, got them signed. But then they were not active for a while and came back with like an indie record. So they came back to the States and were doing what was for them a smaller tour. It was like
Okay.
a theater and big club tour as opposed to like, the big stadiums with POD at the
Yeah.
time or
Yeah.
something like that. So it was huge for us, probably small for them, but huge
Yeah.
for us.
Okay. Actually, is saying that they, you got a bit of your aesthetic from them. Even on that tour, I remember, like you guys you were always kind of uniformed. Even on the Great Depression tour, they were in like these Great Depression era
Yeah.
clothes. So I just they had that same kind of mindset for an aesthetic,
Yeah, yeah.
even on
It's
albums like that.
very conceptually minded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool.